In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a radial rosette, such as the one you see here, using the Radial Rosette Maker jig. I begin by cutting the wood I've chosen for my rosette into 2-inch wide strips. It's important that the grain is running widthwise here. I prefer the material to be about 1/8 of an inch in thickness, give or take 1/32 of an inch. This, by the way, is a great opportunity to make use of scraps or offcuts from back and side sets. I position a scrap block underneath the wedge template. Now I place one of the wood strips under the wedge template and orient the grain lines with the center line. Now before we start cutting, we need to hold the jig down with a clamp. You can place a clamp anywhere on the jig, but I like to place it right over the wedge template just for a little extra security in making sure that the wood strip doesn't shift out of position while I'm cutting. Then I cut off the excess on both sides of the template with a small saw. I'm using a Dazuki saw here, but you could use a small back saw as well, like a dovetail saw. Really any saw as long as the saw is rigid rather than flexible. I loosen the screws and set aside the tapered piece that I've created. I can now flip over and reinsert the rest of the wood strip beneath the template so that the angled edge lines up with the template edge. The grain lines should already be relatively in line with the center line of the template. It's helpful to use the last piece you cut as a sort of backstop to help line up the wood strip against the edge, like you see me doing here. I cut again and set aside the next tapered piece. Now I repeat the process, cutting, flipping, and setting aside tapered pieces until I have 12 pieces. Now we're ready to begin assembling the tapered pieces into our rosette. First, I remove the wedge template and the circle clamp. Next, apply paste wax to the bottom of the circle clamp. This is to prevent you from gluing your rosette to the jig. For the same reason, you want to cover the jig surface in wax paper. I place the circle clamp back in its home by puncturing the 3 socket cap screws through the wax paper and tightening them down. Don't tighten them all the way just yet. Now we need to clean up the edges of our tapered pieces so that they have a seamless fit. To do this, I like to set up what is essentially a mini shooting board. I take my scrap block and I clamp it to the edge of the workbench so that the body of the clamp acts as the backstop for my improvised shooting board. Now, using a block plane, I clean up and square the edge. 1 to 3 passes is really all you need to square up and smooth out the saw cut. I do this on both sides. I place this first tapered piece beneath the circle clamp and position it so that the edges line up with the radial lines on the jig. I place a scrap piece on the other side just to prop up that side of the clamp for now. Later on, I will remove that piece. Now I tighten the 3 socket cap screws just enough to hold the 2 pieces in place. Now I select my next tapered piece, clean it up on the shooting board, and slide it under the clamp adjacent to the first piece. You may have to loosen the clamp slightly to slide the piece under. I position this piece so that the edges line up with the radial lines. If the taper seems a little bit off, I can adjust the fit of that piece on the shooting board. Once the taper matches, I replace the piece and, if necessary, tighten down the clamp just slightly so that it gently holds the pieces in position. Now I run a bead of water-thin cyanoacrylate glue, that's super glue, along the joint. Only the water-thin stuff is really thin enough to wick down into the joint. Next, spray it with accelerator to instantly cure the glue. Next, I simply repeat this assembly process until all 12 pieces are installed. You may be tempted to skip the 12th piece because you know that the fretboard tongue will cover that part of the rosette anyway. I would advise against this. You will get a cleaner cut when you route out the rosette if the rosette has the rigidity of a closed loop. Now onto routing and removing our rosette. Before we get started, it's a good idea to tighten down the circle clamp screws just a little bit. You don't want to over tighten here. You can actually break the acrylic clamp if you tighten them too much. It's really just a slight snugging up, since now we're going to be routing these and we no longer need the clamp to be loose enough to be able to slide pieces underneath. Set up a Dremel tool in a circle cutting jig and place the circle cutting jig on the pin. I'm using a 3/32 of an inch spiral downcut bit in this case, but you can use a variety of bits and bit sizes. Set your circle cutter's radius to make the outside cut first. This is crucial. If you make the inside cut first, then the clamp will no longer be holding your rosette in place, making the outside cut difficult or impossible. Adjust the bit's depth to make an initial just grazing pass. Every pass should begin and end in the same place because, as previously mentioned, the fretboard will cover part of the rosette, and you are far more likely to damage your rosette when you are starting or stopping the bit, so it makes sense to always start and stop the bit in the same place, the place that will be covered by the fretboard tongue. Adjust the bit's depth by a 32nd of an inch or less for another pass. Continue routing and adjusting the depth until you're through the workpiece. Next, you simply adjust the circle cutting jig's radius for the inside cuts and do the same thing for those inside cuts. And that's all it takes. Now you have a beautiful radial rosette, something to really frame the sound hole and set your guitar apart from others. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to use the alternate pin location on the Radial Rosette Maker jig in order to create offset rosettes, such as the one you see here. If you learned something here, please give this video a like and subscribe so you can be notified when I release a new DIY guitar making video every Friday. And if you want to really learn more, take one of my structured online courses at ericschaferguitars.com. or register for a hands-on guitar building workshop here with me in Burnville, Pennsylvania.